Okay, so what I'm going to do this morning is it's kind of two parts because I wanted to, as it's the first Sunday of the year, I wanted to remind us and felt it was right to remind us about what we're about as a church, what we're trying to do, and why we're doing that, and what God's asked us to do. And this isn't something that is kind of this is how you do church. This is how God's asked us to do church, and what he's asked us as a church to focus on. And so in order to do that, we have to be faithful to that and work towards that. And we talked a lot about this at the start of last year and in the middle of last year, and then did a little bit more at the end of last year. So some of you will have seen some of the things that I'm going to put up. To others of you, it'll be news or you'll have forgotten or whatever. But that's kind of the first part of the talk. The second part of the talk, one of the things I talk about in the first bit is about something called spiritual disciplines, things we build into our life that God has given us as tools so we grow in our relationship with him. And I'm going to focus down on one of those spiritual disciplines that I haven't talked about for, well over 2 years now. And I really felt that God was on my case to talk about it again. Okay, so if you've been around Faith Life for any length of time, you'll have seen this diagram. If you haven't seen this diagram, if this is new to you, well, you've actually come on a really good morning, because it gives you the ability to kind of find out what we're about and why we do what we do. And this diagram, the idea behind it is that the vision, or it was actually a vision. The vision that God gave when we started Faith Life, we boiled it down into these words, that we are about leading people into a growing relationship with Jesus. And that works right across a spectrum. And the idea behind this line, because you can tell it's just like a PowerPoint line, but the idea behind it is that somewhere on any person's journey, we have this point where they decide they're going to follow Jesus, and we'll call that a new believer. But we don't just, the idea is that what God's asked us to do starts well before that point to reach those who don't know him yet, and ends right over this side with those who are fully mature and have a deep relationship with Jesus. And of course, that's where we all want to get to. But to get us from somewhere over here, or even from that new believer point, sometimes that can look daunting. If you're a new Christian, a new believer, or you're not really sure, or you haven't actually made that step yet, then it can be daunting, because you see all these mature Christians, or you think they're mature, and you want to be like them and grow to be like them, but you've got no idea how to get there. And so what God's asked us to do as a church is to work towards the point where everybody can make that journey, rather than just standing over here at this end line where there's a small group of us, and I wouldn't count myself in that group. So I don't actually think until we get to heaven we ever get fully mature, because we don't see everything and understand everything. But there's a small group of us over this end, and we're all going, why don't you come over here and do what we do and look like us? And everybody else has no idea how to get there. So we want to be a church that includes everybody wherever they are on that line, and works for everybody wherever they are on that line. And you can see that would be a big challenge. It would be much easier just to do things that everybody does, and just do it for a few people and expect everybody else to join in. It would be much easier. But that isn't what God's asked us to do. So we need to be faithful to do what God's asked us to do. And so one of the things that we focused on last year was this bit down at that end. And the reason for that was that during that horrible thing, which is now 4 years behind us, heading towards 5 years behind us, called lockdown, the church changed and people changed. And actually people haven't changed back. But one of the things that really happened to us as a church, and happened to many churches, is because it was so difficult to get through that time. We actually weren't able to meet in our previous venue for 16 months. 16 months we were online. And that has an effect. And the thing we lost was that sense of facing outwards to those who don't know Jesus yet. So we started to work hard at that last year and bring through that message and bring through that understanding. So, the way I rephrase it is repointing the church towards the mission field. And so that's some of the stuff that we put in last year. And we've started to do that, but we need to keep on doing those things. People don't come to Jesus. They do come to Jesus in an instant, but it can be like a long journey to get them to that instant. And the first thing we need to do is to connect with people who don't know him. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, some of us would say, well, actually, that's really difficult because I actually really don't know anybody outside the church. All my friends go to church. They're in this church. And so we have to do things whereby we can start to build connections and relationships with people who don't know him. And one of those is actually getting known in this community as a church that is for people in this community. That we're for them, not against them. We're here to help them find Jesus, not here to tell them off. And we need to work past all those trust issues that people have with Christians where they see us as perhaps a bit extremist or a bit strong or whatever, to actually show what we're trying to do is what Jesus asked us to do, which is to love people, to love one another. And so what we did last year, and you can go on to the next slide, is we started to put in stuff down this bottom end. We started to work on things like Easter Get Messy, Jingle Jam, outreach in the autumn, which I'm not allowed to call Halloween because it wasn't Halloween. What was it called? Awesome Costume Party. And other things that we've been doing. Next week's event is part of this, is to give us ways of connecting with people who actually don't know Jesus yet, and to break down those trust barriers. So what have we achieved in what we've been trying to do that? Well, the first thing that the biggest thing that we've achieved, I think, is we've changed the conversation. We've changed the conversation whereby, and you might think this is crazy, but this is reality. So if we wind back 12 months, we were looking at how we could reach people in the community that Christmas, and we got to the point where the option that we had, because we weren't responding, was Jules and I standing outside the community centre singing carols. Just two of us. Because that's where we got ourselves to post-lockdown. We don't want to be close to people. We don't want to know people. We're just doing okay. This year, for Jingle Jam, we needed 21 volunteers, and we ended up with more than 21 volunteers. So that's a big change. And just the fact that we are doing those things, at the Get Messy, the Easter one we didn't intend it, but we ended up with 122 kids coming, so that was fantastic, and their families. We were slightly more controlled at Jingle Jam and ended up, I think it was about 70 with their parents. But the big thing about the 60 or 70 who came to Jingle Jam is some of them then came to our Christmas service the next day. They heard the gospel. Those kids all walked through the Christmas story. For many of them, they'd never heard it because they don't teach it in schools now. It's just something else. And so that's a big thing for us. And so we're working towards that. But the other thing that you should be able to see is we're actually here. That's a big part of us being able to do what God's asked us to do. To put ourselves not out there in the school where nobody knows we are and we're irritating because we're taking car parking spaces, to a place where actually we have car parking spaces and we're right at the centre of the community. And that's a big thing for us, and this is a big opportunity for us. And so that's something we've done. We've run our first starting point. We had there's 5 of us there in the room, including myself, and we'd not done that before. In fact, this time last year we didn't even know how to do it. And we've run this course for those who are new to faith or aren't sure about their faith or just really want to explore it. And I have to say, it was fantastic. The guys that we had on that course, diverse backgrounds, but it worked brilliantly. So we want to keep on doing that. We want to keep on introducing people to that course as a way of accessing to start the conversation about what it means to follow Jesus. And so we've done that. So that's kind of some of the stuff we focus on. Now, I want to move to the other side of that line, that fictitious line that I put up there, on what do we do, or what's our plan, or what we're trying to do for those who don't yet know Jesus and want to grow. And one of the things that we need to be able to do is provide steps so that wherever you are on your journey towards a deeper relationship with Jesus, you can find the next step or the next thing to connect for you. And that means that we need to put in place or improve or just even champion or get excited about things that we do apart from Sundays. Sundays is part of it. Sundays is where we reach right across the spectrum. Sundays is where we want to challenge not just people to start to follow Jesus, but for people who have been following Jesus for 30 or 40 years to actually follow him more closely and to actually live in the way he calls us to live. And so what we have when we're on this side, I think it's the next diagram. It's not. Yeah. So what we talked about quite a bit last year is, how do you grow in relationship with Jesus? So we as a church, we call Faith Life Church. And that means that we have a particular call, which is to teach people faith. Faith, lots of people talk about a lot of things to do with faith, but at its real base, faith means, and this is how Jesus defines it, faith means trusting Jesus whatever is going on in your life. That he is who he says he is and will do what he said he will do. So that's how we grow in our relationship with Jesus, because growing in relationship is really just growing in trust. Like those of you who have been married for a long time or even just a few years, you know that as your relationship grows, a lot of that is how you learn to understand each other, trust each other, put the other first. And so that's kind of what we want to build. And we talked about these things, and I'm going to come on to these in a minute, called 6 things that grow your faith. So basically, when we looked at some research that had been done across a lot of churches, and they'd interviewed thousands of people about their faith journey. And what was it that really helped them on their faith journey? And they came up with a constant and a consistent set of 6 things. And I'll talk about those in a minute, because we did a whole sermon series on it last year. So if you want to go into this in depth, we've got a whole sermon series on our website. It's on our YouTube channel. Did we call it? What did we call it? Did we call it 6 Things That Grow Your Faith, or did we give it another title? How to grow. How to grow. You see, we even simpler than 6 things. How to grow. Because our goal is for all of us to move along that line to get to the line of greater maturity, greater depth of relationship with Jesus. So the question is, what do we mean by a mature Christian? Because we'd all like to think of ourselves as a mature Christian, but how do we know if we are? Because some people think that maturity is, as a Christian, is coming to church every week and I volunteer for things. Some people think of maturity as a Christian is that I've got this spiritual gift, or I've got that spiritual gift, or I can do this. And some people think of maturity as a particular form or way of doing their own personal times with God, or their own prayer times, or their own what their church meetings look like or what their life group looks like. And so we kind of have this picture of what it means to be a mature Christian in our mind. And one of the barriers to us reaching maturity down that end would be if our picture was incomplete. If we don't have the full picture, but we think that we have it and we are it. Because the truth is, we all need to grow because none of us are like Jesus yet. And according to Jesus and according to the disciples and those who wrote the New Testament, the apostles, people like Paul, Peter, John, and so on, maturity, the way they always and consistently define it is with one word: Christ-likeness. Being like Jesus. Looking like Jesus in the way we do things, the way we take our decisions, the way we make our choices, the way we love one another, the way we put others first before ourselves. It's the opposite of the self-loving lifestyle that the world promotes. It's reacting and acting like Jesus is maturity. And we all get there in different ways. That's part of the problem of what God's given us to do, is we all have different ways that we progress along that line. And, we express them differently. But last year we talked about these things, these 6 common factors that people will tell you about in their journey by which they grew in faith. And here they are, just in case you forgot them or you weren't here at the time. Practical teaching. That's not just teaching for information, that's teaching for application. Deep teaching is not complicated teaching. Deep teaching is only valuable when it's deeply applied. Simple concepts deeply applied is what Jesus called the depth of relationship with him. And he had simple concepts like love one another like I've loved you. And if any of you think that's easy, just try and think about what happened over Christmas in your family or your home or whatever. Or other things that have happened in the recent past. We struggle with that one, and yet that's the big command that Jesus gave us. Love one another in the same way as Jesus loved us. Lay your lives down for one another. In everything you choose to do and react and say and think, you put others before yourself. That's deep teaching, Jesus style. And then relationships. That's why we want to encourage people to be in life groups, to connect with each other. That's why we've made some changes in the way the worship team gets together. And we're starting something new this week where I'm going to meet with the worship leaders on a regular basis. Because we want to build that sense where we have relationship, because our faith grows best in relationship. And then the other ones, I'll just run through them. Personal encounter, getting involved in ministry, doing your part. There's people doing ministry right now, other than me, other than the worship team. They're upstairs, they've set up, they put speakers through to Creche, they're on the welcome team, they're on the car park. That's ministry, and we get to know and build our faith in the things that we encounter in that ministry. And in all of that, we're better together. One of the things that happened pre-COVID, but was accelerated by COVID, is that somehow the body of Christ got this idea that we can do our own Christianity on our own. And so it doesn't really matter if we're not very often at church or whatever. And so it's become an increasing pattern for churches right across the West, that the norm now by which people measure, are you faithfully attending church, is if you go once a month. Now, in my day, even into the recent, maybe 15, 20 years ago, the question was, do you go once or twice on a Sunday? It wasn't, do you go once a month? But we've absorbed some of societies where lots of activities now take place on a Sunday and we join in them. And so we need to push back on that, because that stops us growing in our relationship with Jesus. you probably saw that I missed one, private disciplines. I'm going to come on to that. Basically, I missed it because there's 5 of them that we talked about when we did this. This is stuff you do yourself. That's why it's called private. Studying scripture, prayer, giving, observing the Sabbath, and fasting. And we talked about those. And I'm going to focus down in a minute on one of those, which is giving. Okay, so the thing about these 6 things that grow your faith is, if I show you that list, you've got 1 or 2 that you really like, that are your favourite, that you got, yeah, that's me. I mean, for me, it's practical teaching, love practical teaching, and I love those private disciplines. That's me. I would build my entire church on that if it was down to me, because that's what I like. If you're Cheryl, you might like personally involved ministry and providential relationships, because Cheryl loves cuddling people and hugging people and just being lovely to people, which she's very, very good at. But the point is that whilst we all have an idea of that influences our idea of what we would like our church that we go to look like. It needs to look like my 2 favourites. And the problem with that is when you put that across the whole body of Christ, what that has done is that it's killed growth on an individual basis of people knowing Jesus genuinely in relationship. And the reason for that is you need all 6 in order to grow. You need it in the church that you're part of, but you need it on an individual level as well. And that's why we can't afford to build a very small, focused on 1 or 2 of those. We want to actually put in place genuine parts that fulfill all of them. Because otherwise, we won't grow as a church. We won't grow as individuals as a church, and you won't grow as a church, even though you prefer particular styles or particular ways of thinking, or you want to emphasize certain things. The last part of that, before I come on to the giving thing, is when we look at those 6 things, when we look at what we're trying to do, whilst we are currently here now on a Sunday, church is not a Sunday. Your church is never intended to just be a Sunday. Sundays are really, really important because they're when we all come together. It's where we can bring through the messages that we believe God's talking to us as a church. It's where we can worship together. It's where we can pray together. It's where we can share together. It's where we can build relationships. Massively important. That's why it's really important that we're all here as often as possible. And that not doing the way of post-COVID, but the way of 5-10 years ago when we're here nearly every Sunday when we can get here. And that's important, not just for you, but for everybody else. But the point I want to make here is it would be a mistake if we try to shove everything, every part of those 6 things that grow your faith into a Sunday morning. Because I'm sure that if I took a poll around the room, we'd all like a bit more of this or a bit less of that and some more of this and some less of that and whatever. And we'd all have different views. But the point is, we're not just here on a Sunday. We're meant to be a body of believers who are gathered together around a mission. And that takes place in life groups. That takes place in prayer meetings. That takes place in events that we do. That takes place in outreach events. That takes place in our own times. And we need to do all of them well and do what each one is designed to do. I mean, like, just to put it the other way around from the way we normally think about it. If I turned up at a prayer meeting and said, hey guys, great that you love to pray, but actually I want to give a 45-minute sermon, whilst there might be 1 or 2 people who go, okay, look, you love Mark's sermon. Generally, that's not what a prayer meeting's for. So that's not what we do. But sometimes we think the other way around, that we need to cram everything into a Sunday. No, we need to be holistic believers 24/7. And do every bit that we do well. You can skip the next slide. So, the vision that Jesus gave us, or God gave us right at the start, is to lead people into a growing relationship with Christ. That's the vision. That's what we're aiming for. The vision is always in the future. Honestly, it might disappoint you, but we're never going to get there. But we can keep on moving towards that because we always want to be growing, and it's always possible to grow. But within that, Jesus didn't just say, that's where I want you to be going. He said, hey guys, I also want you to join me on this thing called a mission. And here's the mission. I want you to go and make disciples. The disciples bit is the growing in relationship with Jesus. The go is going and finding people and helping them find Jesus and then grow in relationship with Jesus. So it's the full thing. So go and make disciples. And in the Gospel of Mark talks about what the goal of discipleship is. And the goal of discipleship is love the Lord your God, love others as yourself. And then Jesus comes along, and John, who was sat there listening to it, heard this, and Jesus said, I'm going to make it even simpler for you. Love one another in the same way as I have loved you. That's the goal of everything we are trying to do. That we are people who love like Jesus. Love one another in the same way as Jesus loved us. In our decisions, in our choices, in the way we do things, in the way we care for each other, in the way we handle disagreement, in the way we handle everything, we should look like Jesus. Because that's the mission. The mission is to reach people so that they get to know Jesus. And Jesus said, the point of loving one another like I love you is the only way that people who are not already part of you can tell you are actually my disciple. That's what they're looking for. That's what they're measuring it by. So that's our mission, is to reach people with that love and to live out that love in the same way as Jesus has asked us to. Okay, does that make sense? Hopefully it makes sense. And that's how we should measure our success as a church. Because if we can get that element, all the other stuff follows. Jesus says, that's when people get drawn to me. That's when people know you're really my disciples. So, in part, the kind of ability to reach people in large part depends on how we behave towards one another and we behave towards them. And that's about our heart. And the thing about our heart, and I actually did I can't remember, it was 2 or 3 part series on this last year. Go and you can get it all in detail, but that's where I'm going now, called Check Your Pulse. Or Check Your Heart. Was it Check Your Pulse? It was Check Your Pulse, wasn't it? Check Your Pulse, yeah. And about the signs where you can actually tell where you are on your own spiritual journey. And one of those signs, the biggest one that Jesus highlighted is the best way you can tell in how you're doing in looking like me is how's your giving. Now, I want you to remember something as I kind of do these next 10 to 15 minutes. I want you to remember something. This is Jesus saying this. This isn't me. And towards the end, it's also the Apostle Paul saying it. It's not me. This isn't stuff that church leaders invented. This is Jesus saying this is really important. Jesus talks about this topic more than any other. And the point is that God deals with your giving. God deals with your money. Why? Not because he's after your money, but because he's after your heart. And he knows that if he can get to your wallet, he can get to your heart, because the two are connected. There's just this indelible connection between the two. And it's a barometer of our relationship with God, how we handle our finances and how generous we are and how we support the work he's doing. Just again, remember, that's not me saying that, that's Jesus. So this is what Jesus says. Give and you will receive. I want you to see something there. The giving comes first. Give and you will receive. Your gift will return to you in full, pressed down, shaken together to make room for more, running over and poured into your lap. The amount you give determines the amount you get back. That's not Jesus being manipulated. In actual fact, he's not just talking about money when he's in that context. In that context, he's talking about the way we judge each other, the way we relate to each other. He talks about the way we care for each other, the way we relate to each other, and the way we give in total. And so giving of finances is part of that, but a very important part, because often Jesus talks specifically about money, but in this context, he's talking about a bigger kingdom principle. And he's saying this is for those who trust me. This is for those who love me. This isn't an automatic like slot machine. This only works if you actually live it. If you don't live it, what you do is you opt out of the way the kingdom works and you're left to your own devices in the way the world works. And I don't want to be difficult about this, and this is just a reflection that in 17 years of pastoring, you get to observe certain principles. And here's the principles that I've observed, because it's not good to necessarily quote a specific person or specific. Here's a general principle. People who have not given have often had the biggest financial issues. People who have stopped giving have often found themselves with job difficulties, family difficulties, unable to meet the mortgages. That's not, I don't know why that is, but Jesus tells me that's the way it is. And I've seen enough people experience that, and some of you are experiencing that right at the moment, to know that that's true. So that gives me confidence that Jesus is actually telling me something that's true. And then he says something else. So just to give you an idea of that good measure, pressed down, whatever that is. That's you see that in the book of Ruth, but you also see it right through Jewish culture at the time. In that there would be landowners and farmers, and they would part of the way that the Jewish society operated was that they would have this harvest, and they would instruct the harvesters not to harvest at the very edge of the field. And so when all the sort of stuff went from where they were harvesting and it went to the side of the field, and people who had nothing would come along and gather that stuff in baskets. Now, here's the point. The guys who were doing the harvesting, they just filled the baskets, chucked them in a truck and cart, and then carried on, filled the basket, carried on. The people who were gathering, the people who needed what that was designed to apply, couldn't just live like that. So they would get their baskets and they would fill them as full as they could. And then what they would do, because this had to do them for the rest of the year, they would press it down and push it down so it all got compacted. And you know yourself that even when you've done that, you haven't got all the air out of it. So they then shake it, and you see people doing that when they make coffee, the baristas getting the air out. And so they do that, and it would create more space. And then they'd fill it up, and then fill it right up to overflowing, and then try and carry this stuff home. And Jesus is saying that if you want to gather in your life like that, then it's proportionate to how much you put in, how much you give. So here's something else he says. Don't say don't. Don't, but we do. Don't store up treasures here on earth where moths eat them and rust destroys them, where thieves break in and steal. Store your treasure in heaven where moths and rust cannot destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. Here's the point. Treasure locates your heart. If you want to find out where your heart is, where's your treasure going? Where are you storing it? Are you storing it, for some of it for kingdom purpose, or is it going just for something that will expire when you expire, if it lasts that long? There's a general principle. So this is in the Old Testament. It's in a book called Proverbs, which is the wisdom of Solomon when he was still wise and didn't get distracted by too many women. And so he wrote down this wisdom. Now I want you to hear that. He wrote this down because it's wisdom. This isn't law. Some people think, well, in the Old Testament when they told people to tithe and bring it in and support the local priests and support the temple and support all the people who were working in the temple, that's all law. Some of it's law, but this is wisdom literature. This is wisdom. This is a general kingdom principle. So we can't just ignore this and get out of it by saying, well, we're not under law, we're under grace. The point is that this is a general principle. And the way it works is because it's good for you, good for others, and good to do. That's what wisdom is. Good for you, good for others, and good to do. And this is Solomon. He said, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the best part of everything you produce. Then he will fill your barns with grain and your vats will overflow with good wine. The point is, because it's wisdom, it's not just for Israel. It worked under the old covenant, but it works under the new covenant for us as well. It's the same thing as Jesus was saying when he was here. It's God's system of provision. And we have a choice whether we connect into God's system of provision or we just rely on the world system of provision. And what Jesus was saying and what Solomon was saying is you will get very different results. Okay, so having said that, here we go. Let me bring you back to that original thing that I said is Christ-likeness. What is Christ-likeness? Love one another as I have loved you. In the New Testament, those who'd been with Jesus, like John, and those who were kind of came to follow him later, like James, and Peter was obviously there at the time as well, and he saw all these things. They understood that Jesus had encapsulated his covenant that he came to bring in this law. And they call it the law of Christ, or the royal law. And they say, if you do this, you fulfill all the rest of the law. Because this is the big thing. Love one another like Jesus loved you. If you do that, you will meet all the other things that God would want you to be. So that is Christ-likeness, loving one another in the same way as Jesus loved us. So how do we know if we're managing that? Well, that brings me back to that thing I talked about, check your pulse. And Paul talks about this, the Apostle Paul. Apostle Paul wasn't around at Jesus' time. Well, he was around in Jesus' time, but after Jesus had died and was resurrected, he spent quite a few years killing Christians and getting warrants to chase Christians down and lock them up in prison and basically exterminate them. And he had an encounter with Jesus that changed his life, and he went from that radical persecutor to somebody who went out and told almost all of the known kind of Roman civilization of that time about Jesus and planted churches. And so when he's reflecting on this, one of the things he did is he wrote letters to the churches that he'd helped plant and churches that had asked him specific questions. And at one point, he's talking to a church, and the church is in Corinth, and he's talking to them about, because they promised to give an offering. In fact, they were kind of like, yeah, we believe in all that finance. We believe in kingdom principles. We believe we should do it this way. We believe we should do that. But the reality is that they didn't. So they talked the talk, but didn't walk the walk. And so he's writing to this church in Corinth, and he's going to express some kingdom principles that are new covenant principles. And this is what he said. And this is going to connect to that thing that we are aiming for, which is Christ-likeness. This is what he says. Now I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, what God in his kindness has done through the churches in Macedonia. That's not Corinth, that's a different area. So basically, he's going to hold these churches up as an example to say, this is how you should do it. In fact, they're overdoing it. And you said you were going to do it, but you're not. Everybody thinks you're doing it, but you're not. And so he says, they have been tested. This is the church in Macedonia. They've got problems. They're tested by troubles. They're very poor, but they're also filled with abundant joy, and that joy overflows in rich generosity. For I can testify, so this is Paul, this is his own personal experience. He knows these people. He knows most of them by name. And this is what he said. I can testify that they gave not only what they could afford, but far more. And he doesn't say that that's what you should do. He's just saying that that was their heart. Because the goal is not to bankrupt. You know, that's not the goal. The goal is to trust God. And they did it of their own free will. They begged us again and again for the privilege in sharing for the gift for believers. That's Christ-likeness. If we want to be mature, that's what it'll look like. That's why we still have some way to go on that scale. The Christ-likeness is, I'm going to beg you to get involved in this. I want to bless others. Show me how I can do it. Let me in. So that was their attitude. And he said, and this is the central point he's coming to. They even did more than we had hoped. As a pastor, I would be pretty excited by that one. They did more than we had hoped. For their first action, now listen to this, their first action, their first principle, the driving priority was that they gave themselves to the Lord. That's why this tells us where we are with Jesus. They gave themselves to the Lord and to us, just as God wanted them to do. I'm nearly finished, by the way. They even did more than we'd hoped. Can you have the worship team back up? For their first action was to give themselves to the Lord, just as God wanted them to do. Here's the point. There's a principle that goes right through Scripture, and it starts long before the law ever comes in through Moses. It starts actually with Cain and Abel, which is God actually asks us to give the first part of our best. So the first part of our increase. And in the Old Testament, that generally was 10%. But actually, by the time Paul is writing this, in the Jewish system at that time, most Jews who were faithful observers and went to the temple and things were giving something like 30% of their income. So that just gives you a proportion of it. And he says, they even did more than we'd hoped. For their first action, to give themselves to the Lord. And this is what he's coming to. Why? Why is Paul telling them this? Is Paul telling them this because he wants the money? He's telling them this because it's breaking his heart that they are not doing what Jesus asked them to do. And it's hurting. He's kind of like, I taught you this, guys, but you're not doing it. And that tells me we have a bigger problem. And this is it. I am testing. This is a test. The way we give is a test designed by God. And that might come as a surprise to you. But It's a test not to prove us wrong. It's a test to show us where we are. It's a test not to fail us. It's a test to call us to greater things. It's kind of a scorecard along the way. He says, I'm testing what? I'm testing how generous you are. I'm testing how much money you've got. I'm testing this. I'm testing that. No, none of that. I'm testing your love. Your love for one another and for others. Is it the same as Jesus? Because God gave his first fruits. God gave his best because he gave us Jesus. And Jesus gave us everything. Not 10%, but 100%. Jesus gave us everything. So he's saying, I'm testing. This is how you can work out where you are on your journey to that maturity by how genuine your love is. Why I've done this morning? The reason I've done this is twofold. Firstly, to remind us what we're about as a church. But secondly, because this will help us understand where we are corporately and as individuals in getting to that goal that Jesus gave us of leading people into a growing relationship with Christ, where we look increasing like Jesus. The goal is Christ-likeness, and giving is an important part of shaping your heart, getting it away from the tyranny of the society we live in and setting you free to follow him. And that's why I've talked about it, and that's why it's important.